There's a hidden dimension to people that in the predominant state of body identification is hidden to even themselves, but it's evident in various ways that you can observe. But that dimension is determined by spiritual development or level of consciousness. It's expressed in things like territoriality, the feeling of ownership and the reaction to the fate of things owned. The more caught up in the thought loop and identification with the mind's voice, the more territoriality there'll be generally. Also, the intensity of the need for stimulation. The less easy it is to sit still, the more there is a sense of something to escape, such as an unpleasant memory or an idea. And if there is no such idea, then there's a need to fill the silence to avoid the suffering of boredom. In the unconscious, it's like the need for air. The mind is like a shark that has to keep moving to stay alive. And indeed, if it stops, it could die, because there could appear a space between itself and what's aware of it. The perception of that gap can expose the non-self nature of the conditioning from which that voice arises and strip it of its power to be taken seriously in an automatic and unconscious way. The voice's derivative nature can be realized in that sense of spaciousness. It's the perception of one kind of separation that destroys another. A lack of inner separation between what's aware and what appears in that awareness creates a stronger sense of outer separation from others. In the total absence of ignorance is no perception of others, and not in a solipsistic way, but rather for lack of unconscious identification with the form and conditioned voice that claims to be its agent. What's aware of that cannot be that any more than one could bite their own teeth, as Alan Watts put it and likely heard it put. If you are not those things, then nobody is. In knowing what one is not, it's known that one is that knowing, and that what knows has no observable qualities for the absence of its appearance as an object in the awareness it is. In the absence of solipsism, it must then be presumed that what others are is wholly identical to the awareness one is, differentiated only by the karma that determines the perspective from which things are perceived. It is the condition of knowing oneself as only that perceiving which supports the assertion that there are no others, put forth by Ramana Maharshi when he was asked how to treat others. There's nothing new under the sun. These pointings will reappear in any human history, like the bow and arrow, because they point to a real condition, the rarity of which relegates it to superstition for the worldling and faith for the believer. But this palpable and perpetual freedom can be discovered in the pursuit of suffering's cause. The uninstructed worldling, in attempting to escape suffering, seeks alignment of the world with the mind's ideal. Whether that ideal tends to preserve or destroy life's conditions depends on the karma, which determines the conditions in which, and thus the experience from which, the mind is built, and thus is the seed of action. It confuses people who think of it as what comes around goes around, karma. They can't differentiate one's sowing from another's reaping. They see karma through the wish for vengeance, not realizing that the harm they wish to see rectified is in fact the rectification that settles outstanding accounts, not an action that puts them out of balance. What you get is the resolution of past action, and in seeking a redundant resolution, then the wheel of samsara keeps turning. Thus the ability to hold a grudge and the need for revenge is another hallmark of unconsciousness. It's maintained by the mental story whose conceptual subject holds the mantle of identity. The ideas about that subject have power over the state of the energy body. There can be no end to samsara if the means of peace is bending the world to one's ideal, because the world is impermanent and it'll always bend back. Liberation is not the holding of concepts, but concepts can point to the truth that reveals it. The Buddha compared spiritual teachings to a raft that need not be carried once the river has been crossed. To challenge this idea of there being no others, there's the question of how can all be one and yet there persist an unknowing between minds. If we are all one, why can't we read minds? Consider the theory of relativity, which I'm told by a YouTube physicist supports the existence of the block universe, wherein the future already exists along with the past in something like a ballistic gel cube, each slice of which is a world made unique by the shape given to it by its moment. What you are, is a fistula of awareness going through that block for the duration of your life. The walls of that fistula are subtle and gross, flesh, energy, and thoughts, which are different vibrations through the same medium of existence. Those vibrations are God's voice, a product of the will that makes all what it is. That's the only free will, all others being an illusion at the margin, an illusion created by the ignorance of body identification and an inability to see how the past makes the full scope of the present. That ignorance makes things meaningful through the perception of scarcity and danger, of being impermanent, finite, and vulnerable. It seems the entire point of existence. This allows for the suffering that motivates the search for its source, which ends only in the discovery of truth, else it continues through this fistula of samsara. It's like a roller coaster. The ignorance part is the suffering, the build-up, the tension, going up the hill, and then the discovery is going down the hill. Awareness passes through the fistula, a tunnel through time-space, the interior of which is coated on one level with the gross flesh, and the other, the subtle impressions in consciousness born of experience that we call the conditioned or conceptual self. The block universe moves through the medium of awareness, and that awareness which passes through these fistulas is wholly innocent, meaning it takes as real everything it perceives. And in fact, when there is the perception of a believing, that believing itself is a projection of which the awareness passing through the tunnel that is you is aware. The awareness that passes through the block universe in the fistula of the living being, it cannot see forward or backward, only the moment that it is in, and it cannot see sideways through the block into other fistulas, which would be mind reading, though the same awareness, which has no substance in this dimension because it does not exist in this dimension, only sees the projection arising from the tunnel wall, though it is of the same substance that is not perceivable in this world, for it only perceives what's projected into the astral. It, that awareness, is itself not a perceivable thing in this world. It is not in this world. It only perceives the projections from this world and perceives either believing or disbelieving, but it is not an object. It is perceiving. We are not ready for heaven. If you've ever worked too hard for too little return because you had to, you know that there's a certain kind of motivation deep inside you that can tolerate it, but only when there are no other alternatives. People are like water and will take the path of least resistance. So to go from a state of total deprivation to an Aladdin's lamp type scenario of abundance would massively change the motivation you could muster to do even the most mundane tasks. I've heard such things about the lives of celebrities who have paid servants doing everything for them. They lose a certain amount of drive and likely, eventually, their practical capabilities could atrophy, assuming they ever had to develop them to begin with. I bring this up because this tendency would have bearing on any scenario wherein the soul moves from lower to higher density. Like to go from our lower density of toil to a dimension where to think of a thing makes it real. So when awareness passes through the fistula, it is limited by all the constraints of the physical world and the karma associated with it, with that fistula. But when the body dies, the awareness is unbound and essentially in the Aladdin's lamp situation, assuming that the subtle aspect of the fistula doesn't carry forth apart from time-space to create some false trap of a world. To go from total ignorance to Aladdin's lamp multiverse where thought is reality could quickly devolve into a hell realm, such as the one portrayed in the old Twilight Zone episode, The Other Place, which I recommend. In that episode, this guy who's a criminal gets killed in the act of robbing a bank or something. ends up in what he thinks is heaven, like a casino where you always win and the women always want you, and just every worldly thing you could want, you could just manifest. And eventually he figures out that that type of abundance is like a hell, because it all comes so easily. But if you were to put like a Buddha in that type of place, it would not be a hell, because their state depends not on the condition. So it could be the most mundane or the worst. It wouldn't matter, because their state is a function of the truth. Like they have this peace that can't be described, but can only be discovered. That's all for now.